It's the morning of June 11th, 1963, in Saigon, which is now called Ho Chi Minh City, and we're at the intersection of two busy roads near the South Vietnamese presidential palace. Western journalists had been tipped off by phone calls the day before, saying that something important would happen the next morning at the spot. Not many journalists showed up, but one who did was American Malcolm Brown. And soon things do start happening. A procession of maybe 300 Buddhist monks and nuns come marching down one of the roads holding signs. They're demanding an end to the persecution of Buddhists by the then Catholic leadership. These Catholic elite in a Buddhist-majority country were banning Buddhist flags, raiding monasteries, confiscating land, and so on.
And of course, this is when there were two Vietnams, the communist North Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh, and South Vietnam supported by the West, in particular America. JFK is the US president, and the Americans are getting more and more involved in the civil war between the North and South, involvement which will soon escalate dramatically in 1965. But as you noted, this is a protest against the persecution of Buddhists.
Right. So the monks and nuns stand aside as a car drives up and stops at the intersection. A Vietnamese monk, likely about 65 years old, gets out of the car, walks over to a busy spot in the middle of this intersection. So I'm sure I'm going to mispronounce this name, but the closest pronunciation guide I could get was Thich Quang Duc is the monk's name. It's his Buddhist name, so, he had many different names, but that's his monk name. He calmly sits down in the traditional Buddhist lotus position on a small cushion. Then a fellow monk walks over and pours a plastic container filled with gasoline onto the senior monk's head and all over his body. Thich Quang Duc, the monk, is seen holding prayer beads, and he says a prayer before striking a match. Flames immediately engulf this man, but he never moves a muscle or makes a sound. The monk's body withers and shrivels up, his head blackening and charring. Reports say the crowd is mostly silent, but some are crying loudly. People are praying. One report says a couple of police officers who had arrived, they get down on their knees and bow before the monk. It's a strange atmosphere, a mix of emotions, people transfixed with something both terrible and yet also moving, almost a beautiful serenity.
The Taiwan History Podcast, Formosa Files, is made possible through the generous sponsorship of the Frank C. Chen Foundation. Formosa Files.
Horrible. Yeah, beautiful. It's a hard word to associate with such violence, but I know what you mean. It's the specter of martyrdom, the willingness to die for your faith. These kind of acts and the emotions they generate have a long history. But what made this even more of a gut punch was the picture that journalist Malcolm Brown took, a shocking photograph that quickly became iconic. U.S. President John F. Kennedy said, quote, "No news picture in history has generated so much emotion around the world as that one," end quote. And JFK had no way of knowing that soon images from his own death, just about 5 months later, would also become iconic.
Wow, so John, a powerfully emotional scene, an act of protest, non-violent against others. I think self-immolation, or setting oneself on fire in protest, is seen by many as more of a part of Asian culture, and there's some truth to this. In 2023, Radio Free Asia published a piece about a representative from the Dalai Lama Foundation, who on December 10th of that year, December 10th is Human Rights Day, set up an exhibit honoring 166 Tibetans who have set themselves on fire over the previous 10 years as acts of protest against Chinese Communist Party rule. And the exhibitor said, "I was very worried doing this. I don't want people to think I'm encouraging it, but these things happened. That's a fact," end quote. And outside of Asia, of course, in history, there's plenty of examples. Some Protestant martyrs even jumping onto burning pyres, joyfully accepting death. And then more recently in America during the Vietnam War, there was an American man who set himself on fire in front of the Pentagon as a war protest. And it's happened a couple of other times as well in North America that I know of. The one I can think of that maybe is one of the more consequential in recent years is December 2010, when Tunisian Mohamed Bouazi couldn't take police harassment and government corruption anymore and set himself on fire. So Mohamed was a fruit vendor trying to support a very large extended family. He only got a couple of hours of sleep every night and then up back to work. The cops would confiscate his scales or his goods as he didn't have a permit and no money for a bribe. So he tries to use the system. He goes to the provincial governor's office to try and work something out, but the guy in charge won't even see him. Mohamed Bouazi's cousin told the media that he had said, "I'm so fed up and tired, and I can't breathe anymore." So this poor man who sparked the Arab Spring, many believe, he lingered in the hospital for 2.5 weeks before dying. And his relatives say that really the only reason it sparked the Arab Spring or changed anything was because it was caught on camera and put out on the internet. So I guess that's one standard we can apply to assessing such drastic acts. Did it change anything? So what about the case of the monk in Vietnam? Did it change anything?
Yes and no. A very typical answer I give.
Yes.
Yes. So there was a coup later that year, and the pro-Catholic president was overthrown. This coup was with the help of the CIA, but according to what is known, the CIA wasn't expecting that the president would be killed during the coup. So sadly, this type of violence, even sort of non-violent violence, seems to beget violence. We have several other Buddhist monks setting themselves on fire in solidarity. And the Civil War would, of course, become much worse. The Vietnam War formally ended in 1975. Hard to put a start date on it, but it's usually 1955. So that's 20 years. During that time, the ROC, Taiwan, was involved in many ways. US bases here in Taiwan, Air Force bases, and Taiwan was an important R&R hub for US troops. ROC military personnel also secretly assisted the US secret ops in Vietnam. We'll be bringing you stories from this time period. But Eryk, you didn't tell this story as a springboard for Vietnam War stories, did you?
No. So this Formosa Files episode is being released on the 228 national holiday, officially called Peace Memorial Day, I believe. Mm-hmm. So this year, 2025, marks 78 years since what's called the 228 incident or 228 massacre. But it's misleading to think of it as a single date. We've told parts of the story before, and we will explore more in the future. But in short, the newly arrived KMT aren't managing the ex-Japanese colony of Taiwan very well since taking over after the end of World War II in late 1945. A state monopoly bureau agent, so a kind of soldier tasked with making sure people pay taxes on items including alcohol and cigarettes. So this agent finds a woman selling contraband cigarettes. This happens near the Taipei train station. He gets into an argument, perhaps pushes the woman around a bit. A crowd sees what's going on. The crowd gets angry. They encircle the agent. The agent probably thought he was going to get lynched. So he fires into the crowd. His bullet hits one man, and that man would die the next day, sparking larger protests. And then you have soldiers firing into these protesters. And so begins a widespread revolt by the Taiwanese against the new KMT rulers.
And this violent episode would usher in a period called the White Terror. 4 decades of repression of the majority Taiwanese by the ruling Chinese nationalist government.
In the days immediately after 228, there was plenty of nastiness on both sides. It's not talked about as much maybe as it should be, but Chinese people were dragged out and beaten sometimes to death by Taiwanese mobs. Taiwanese on loudspeakers at night playing Japanese music, taunting Chinese, many civilians, taunting them with violence.
Yeah. And not long after that, nationalist troops arrived and there was a brutal crackdown. Shootings in the street. Taiwanese people were pushed into the back of trucks, driven away and never seen again. Arrests, executions, unjust verdicts, and long prison sentences. By the end of March, the army had regained control, but the persecution continued, people disappearing in the middle of the night.
And this repression would continue into the 1950s and 60s and beyond. Things get significantly better towards the end of Chiang Kai-shek's time on Earth, and then his son and successor, Chiang Jing-kuo, would begin a slow march to the end of martial law in 1987.
Yes, but a quick return to the days and nights following February 28, 1947. We also know of stories of kindness and heroism, Chinese hiding Taiwanese from soldiers, or Taiwanese hiding their Chinese neighbors from a mob.
Yeah.
Okay, but the main person we are focusing on today, he's born in 1947, roughly 6 months after that fateful day of 228. And he would die at the early age of 41 in 1989. His death by self-immolation, so setting himself on fire. Likely as shocking for Taiwanese as was the death by fire of that monk in Vietnam.
Actually, I'm sure for some in Taiwan, the death of Cheng Nan-jung, better known perhaps to many by his nickname, English name, Nylon Deng, was a major shock. But it didn't have the same power as the monk in 1963 or the poor Tunisian fruit vendor in 2010. And mostly that's because the government was able to control the narrative. Our research guy and Chinese Formosa Files co-host Eryk Michael, he searched the internet for official comments from that day or the following days, and it's pretty quiet. And Eryk found a copy of what the Central News Agency, Taiwan's official mouthpiece, what they had to say the day after Nylon Deng's death. And it's what you might expect. The Minister of the Interior is quoted in the paper. He says, "This is a judicial case, not a political one. The arresting process was legal." And the newspaper also has stuff condemning the DPP for stirring up emotions. Violence is unacceptable. And they stress that the arrest was a legal operation. By keeping it as low-key as possible, the outside world gets as little info as possible. So there's not some similar statement as JFK's from George H.W. Bush, for example. And to this day, it's not exactly among the best-known stories from the Taiwan democracy movement days. But okay, before we tell you a story, John, this is 1989, the year of the quote-unquote incident in Tiananmen Square, the year the Berlin Wall fell, the USSR is in meltdown, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania get independence in 1989, and also, that same year, a man named Tim Berners-Lee invented what he called the World Wide Web, or the Internet. So 1989, an incredible year across the world. But in Taiwan, as we said, martial law by this time is over, repealed in 1987. Things were looking up. The opposition party, the DPP, was legal. There was talk of more freedoms, rumors of direct elections for maybe even the president. So why would someone feel the need to protest the government, then led by President Lee Teng-hui, in such a drastic way in 1989?
Well, martial law had ended in 87. A year before that, the DPP was technically not completely illegal, and CCK decided to allow it to run. He died in 1988. Lee Teng-hui becomes president. So yeah, as you put it, things were looking up by 1989. But when Nylon Deng made his final protest in April 1989, Taiwan was still not quite free of its authoritarian past. For example, you could still be arrested for sedition, for advocating for independence, Taiwan independence. That was sedition, treason, insurrection, whatever you want to call it, punishable by death. And that's exactly the charge Nylon Deng was facing for publishing a proposal for a Republic of Taiwan constitution.
Okay, so let's introduce our protagonist. So his name is Zheng. It's spelt often as C-H-E-N-G, Zheng. And then he's often commonly called Deng. And from what I understand, the Deng is like a Taiwanese rendition of Zheng. And then the Nylon first name, but we don't know where it comes from. We tried to find an answer for that. It's probably just some sort of a nickname that sounds similar to his Chinese name. Maybe it's also got something to do with Taiwanese.
Nylon is English. It's that synthetic fabric.
Right.
And Nanrong, that's close enough. It's a nickname.
Yeah, I guess so. So for the rest of the episode, we're probably just going to mostly call him Nylon Deng because that's the one that you'll see more commonly in the English sources. Mm-hmm. He's born September 12th, 1947 in Taipei City, and he would later say the 228 incident of the year of his birth tormented him throughout his life. So obviously he wasn't old enough to remember the immediate events that followed the February 28th incident, but his parents, of course, could.
His father had come over to Taiwan from Fujian, immigrated to Taiwan from China in 1934. So that's during the Japanese colonial period. But because his dad was from China, even though not one of the KMT Chinese who fled the Civil War later, his family was still considered Wai Shangren, or literally from an outside province, meaning not Taiwanese. Nylon said his family was protected by their Taiwanese neighbors during 228, saved from some sort of retaliation by angry Taiwanese. I'm not sure exactly when, but apparently before Nylon started elementary school, the family moved out of the capital of Taipei over the mountains to the relatively sleepy, peaceful town of Luodong in Yilan County. That's in the northeast of Taiwan.
And most of the local people in that town, Luodong, spoke Taiwanese, the common language spoken by most Chinese in Taiwan before the arrival of the nationalists. So Nylon Deng grows up speaking Taiwanese as pretty much a native language. His parents opened up a hairdressing salon at a paper mill, so he grows up not wealthy by any means, but also not poor. Nylon Deng had 3 brothers who were born in quick succession. So I guess if you had seen this family in, say, the early 1950s, you might have assumed, they're set for a pretty decent life in this new nationalist-run Taiwan.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's interesting that his dad was a mainlander and his mum a local. Nylon Deng was an early example of the future of Taiwan. Mainlanders and locals intermarrying, having children, and some or many of those children would grow up not to necessarily view themselves as having a strong connection to the Republic of China.
Indeed, yeah. I think about the kind of reversal of fate, because as a baby, he would have been deemed a mainlander, but growing up speaking Taiwanese makes him as a kid Taiwanese. I read about incidents where he and his younger brother joined other Taiwanese kids and then got into fights with mainlander school children.
This kind of stuff was common, more common than you might think. It's worth remembering that while mainlanders controlled the levers of power in almost every area, they were in the minority by a huge margin, especially outside of Taipei. And, there were military villages where those who came over in 49 were given a small home to live in, and their sons would sometimes form, I guess, what you might call a gang. More like a pack of hoodlums, really. But they did this for protection, and likewise, the native Taiwanese kids had their gangs as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had a very good friend who's a great example of the complicated concept of identity for young people in Taiwan, even as late as like the late 70s and early 80s. He's born to a mainland army dad and a Taiwanese mom in rural Kaohsiung. He preferred to speak Taiwanese. Maybe he identified more with mom than dad because dad was a pretty tough military man. I don't know. But he was treated as a mainlander by the teenagers at school. To be fair, he did live in a military village, so he'd get jumped, get beaten up. So he joined a group of kids like himself, and there were fights. So picture this. We're talking about rural Kaohsiung in late 70s, early 80s. The kids fighting are hurling insults at each other in Taiwanese, but they're still fighting over ethnic heritage. This friend of mine who passed away about a decade ago, he ended up in a juvenile prison for a spell after one of his hits with a baseball bat against a kid coming at him with a metal chain, he claimed, ended up with the other teen boy dying, unfortunately. His dad pulled some strings and he got out pretty fast. But just think about this stuff happening in like 1980.
Yeah, really interesting. Ethnic conflicts between people born and raised a few kilometers away from each other and who mostly speak the same language. But back to Nylon Deng, he may have been a bit of a brawler in his early student years, but quickly he stood out as an excellent student, winning awards for his grades. He got into a good junior high school in Yilan. In 1963, after graduating from junior high, he gave up a spot at the Taipei Institute of Technology, which was where his father wanted him to go, and instead he chose to attend Jianguo Senior High School in Taipei. He's said to have spent most of his free time hanging out at secondhand bookstores.
Yeah, a major bookworm and a bright student. So in 1966, he starts studying engineering at National Cheng Nan-jung University, a very prestigious university in Tainan, southern Taiwan. But engineering bores him, so he drops out and in 1967 is admitted to the Department of Philosophy at Furen Catholic University. That's in New Taipei. And that's where he would meet his future wife, Miss Ye Julan. Deng's wife, Ye Julan, would later go on to serve in many government roles. We'll talk about her a little later.
I'm not exactly sure why, but the following year, so 1968, Cheng Nan-jung transfers to the Department of Philosophy at National Taiwan University, Taida, Taiwan's most prestigious university. And it's during this time there that he met Ing Hai-guang, a philosopher who introduced Western liberal thoughts. We don't have time to tell Ing Hai-guang's story, but a very interesting person. And we'll put a link in the show notes.
Yes, this guy, very interesting. The ideas this Mr. Eam puts in his head are basically, like the works of philosophers such as Bertrand Russell, Karl Popper, ideas that would include social criticism, questioning everything, critical rationalism, liberal democracy, even pacifism, not views necessarily favored by a one-party state. And at Taida, his intellectual curiosity pushes him toward the Dang Wai, or not in the party movement.
The Dang Wai, outside the party, yeah. These groups were the first attempts at serious opposition to the KMT. So political parties other than the KMT, unless you were a clone, such as the China Youth Party or something, mostly banned, but these folks used this workaround, not in the party. But anyway, Dang Wai or not, Nylon Deng couldn't escape the reality of the education system being under the thumb of the state. Here's where we see him make his first major act of protest. All students in Taiwan were required to take a class in Sun Yat-sen thought.
Sun Yat-sen thought. It sounds silly to us today, similar to like Xi Jinping thought or some communist brainwashing. But back then, it was no laughing matter. And, from what I understand, it was compulsory until 2006, which is really hard to believe.
Yeah, I'm amazed by how often we have that phrase off. You wouldn't believe how long it lasted.
Yeah.
But to be fair, the official subject name was the 3 Principles of the People.
So Nylon Deng refuses to take this Sun Yat-sen 3 Principles class, but the university says, not negotiable. Some sources say he returned his diploma in protest. Other sources say no class equals no graduation, and no graduation equals no diploma. So the fact that these two tales are a bit different is going to become more important as we continue the story, because the returned diploma in protest story is a good example of the 100% hero version of his life that's quite commonly found in a lot of articles on him. The couldn't get his diploma version is an example of the it's more complicated version of his life story. The result is the same, no diploma. Whether he returned it or never got it due to refusal to take the class, the outcome is he doesn't have an official university degree. But the two versions, I think, show how stories about people that had complicated lives but are looked up to for some action or reason tend to start moving from fact towards myth.
Yep, I hear you. I agree with you completely. Anyway, his refusal, however it went down, it was a gutsy move. So much easier to take the simple road and just do the class, sleep through it if he wanted to. But yeah, there is a difference between these different versions. As I understand it, Deng wasn't necessarily hostile to the ideas of Dr. Sun Yat-sen. After all, the 3 Principles of the People are noble enough goals. More than that, they're really good. Nationalism, or all the people united by a purpose. The second one, democracy. That's the usual translation, or it's sometimes translated as the rights of the people. And then we have social welfare, welfarism, taking care of people, all good stuff.
I think Nylon Deng expressed something to the effect of, Dr. Sun's ideas, some are good, but that's for China, not Taiwan. And China in the past or now, PRC, ROC, hasn't been able to make democracy work, so maybe we shouldn't follow China's path. Taiwan needs to chart its own way. Okay, so that's going to be part 1. And we promise to bring you part 2 very soon, and that will include, of course, the story of Nylon Deng's end. And as you'll hear in the next episode, that story is a bit different than the one we've been traditionally told. Thanks for listening to Formosa Files.